And to put a finer point on it, what even is static type checking anyways? So TypeScript uses what is called static type checking. This means that types can be checked for issues at compile time. This doesn't mean that JavaScript is untyped. You'll often hear this too. People be like, oh, got to use, TypeScript. It has types. JavaScript has types. TypeScript doesn't add types to JavaScript. All it does is make it so you can catch those type checking violations earlier in the process, right? So JavaScript has type checking. It's called dynamic type checking. This means that JavaScript does have types, but those types are checked at runtime. So what TypeScript gives you is just one little step beyond that, type checking at compile time. Again, like going back to this whole budget, discussion, the question is, how much payoff does static type checking give us relative to other things like design and a new one I haven't really talked about yet, testing? And this gets to my second reason for not caring that much about TypeScript, testing. So I put a lot of effort into writing high quality tests. These tests cover all of the most, critical and even less critical paths if possible. And if there are type errors, I generally will still catch them before deploying because my tests will trigger JavaScript's runtime dynamic type checking. So I guess the other side of this is I do see a lot of projects that use TypeScript but don't have good tests. And I again feel like this is a misplaced use of time. To me, the quality of a program follows generally this hierarchy. The top of the hierarchy is good design, good abstractions, right? Once you get that right, the next thing on the rung of this ladder is good tests. Are the tests good? Do they cover things well? That kind of thing. Once you have those two, what I call sort of foundational pillars figured out, then you can move on to things that have maybe a more minor impact, like static type checking. TypeScript is overhyped, and it leads to worse programs for exactly those reasons. Instead of putting time into design and testing, people put their time into static type checking. I have seen this over and over and over again on projects. They are obsessed with TypeScript and getting all their types right. And I'm like, why are you putting your time into this? Like, look at this code. This isn't a good design. Did you even think about this design? And the answer is always no, I didn't. So I'm like, I don't know. It just feels wrong. Or I'll be like, hey, this actually happens more than the other one even. So I see you added this new feature. Could you add a test for it? Oh, I don't have any more time. This has to get deployed now. And you're like, okay, well, I would have much rather have had good tests than have your type checking implemented. So yeah, I think TypeScript is overhyped. I think it has its place and I do use it, but I often see people using it in place of good design and good testing. So while for most production applications, like I said, I do employ high quality tests and even some static type definitions, I have also experimented with only focusing on good design. Like I spent most of my budget on it. So I wrote a production application. It was, by myself that is in use by real users. And I wrote essentially no tests and I have no static type checking. So this was in primarily in Lisp, React, JavaScript. I spent probably half of the development time on prototyping and design. I went through so many iterations. I don't know. I rewrote probably the bulk of the program at least 4 times, if not more. I kind of didn't keep track, right? But the truth is, the end result, what I have now, is one of my favorite programs to work on. And by far, one of the programs with the fewest bugs. And the best part is the type of bugs that do exist. If there are bugs, they don't usually actually break anything for the user. And working with this program is just an absolute joy. Like, I love it. I'm like, oh, yay, I get to work with this. Like, it makes me so happy. Like, I'm not dreading it. Even though this program is many years old at this point, gone through many iterations, many feature changes, the whole 9 yards, I still love working on it. And every time I add a new feature or change how something works, it's been easy to do and no bugs are jumping out of the woodwork. And it's really the experiment that cemented my viewpoint on static type checking. It's not like I have had this like sort of opinion for a while that I kind of felt like it was sort of overhyped. But this program really cemented this viewpoint in my mind. And I proved, at least to myself, that by far, the most important use of my time is design. I don't have type bugs in that program I was talking about because of good design. This is another thing I feel like people don't realize. It's in good design, I don't need to, the programmer doesn't need to mentally keep track of a whole bunch of different types. Like, oh, can this be null or undefined or whatever? In a well-designed program, those things are, natural and obvious. So you just don't have to worry about it. And this is the thing that I've noticed in my, React and JavaScript programs too. I don't usually have type issues because I always make sure to create good type design. I'm like, even I call it like sort of a mini design pattern, right? Oh, before I rant about, my mini good design patterns, thought I'd hang out with this little stink bug crawling up the cable for the microphone. Hey, buddy, I think it really just wants to hear more about TypeScript. Is that what it is? I don't know. I'm guessing. It hasn't really said much, but anyway, so I like to have this approach where, if you look at my code, you'll notice that I rarely ever let the type of something change. You'll see that even in error cases or before something is initialized, I usually set the variable to the same type it will be throughout the life of the program. So many people focus on type definitions without just being like, oh yeah, if I never change the type of something and the type is obvious by its use or naming or API, then I just really don't benefit that much from static type checking. It was actually kind of funny when I was writing this. I was like, you know what? I've run into so many times now when I've gotten other people's updates on a program and I go to build it and I'm like, yo, it's failing the type check, whatever. And oh, sure enough, there's some bug or whatever, right? And I'm like, it seemed weird to me for a while. I was like, why don't I ever get this? And obviously it's, maybe I wasn't doing TypeScript, so I wasn't getting it catching it at compile time, but it wasn't happening in production at runtime either. I'm like, what is up with this? Why does this happen? And I really think a lot of it's because of this design pattern. When I design my programs, I also design the typing. And it's not me looking at it and trying to make it past the type checking. It's me looking at it and being like, okay, what is the most intuitive to a human for this type to be? And sometimes I have something that does change type, but in an intuitive way, where I'm like, oh yeah, it would make sense that this would be a different type in this case. And the programmer, whoever's using this should, understand that. And so I don't know, it just hasn't really been as much of a problem for me. So, maybe as another takeaway from this is something you could try is, just focusing more on the life cycle of your types in general, not just, the type definitions, but what should this be typed? Should it change? And sometimes I'll even create another variable that represents essentially the same thing, but covers a different type because I'm like, okay, I can see how in the future somebody else is going to come into this program and they're going to think it's this type because of how it's being used here, which will introduce a subtle bug they might not realize, and yes, again, you could have TypeScript and type this all out, but then what's going to happen? They're going to go implement it and, oh crap, my program fails to compile. I messed up this type. I got to go refactor my work, Whereas if you're just designing good types up front, the programmer comes in and goes, oh, okay, obviously in this case, I need to use this one. And then they just use it and their code just works and you move on with your day. You don't have to mess around with a failed build because of my types or whatever, And yeah, so I do have some value for it. And I think place I often use it will be like API boundaries and stuff. Like that's great if it's typed, but even then I find that if you design your APIs well, it's not as important again. I think this really becomes more important when things aren't designed once again. But this also brings me to my final point, and this is specifically about TypeScript itself. So in my opinion, TypeScript it's just not a very good language. It's incredibly verbose as far as static type systems go. So referring back to the whole budget thing, I use static type checking in Lisp and Haskell and other things way more than I do in JavaScript. And that's because TypeScript takes a lot more time for the same results. So there's this algorithm called the Hindley-Milner type inference system, right? That we've had for a long time, decades. And some of these systems I mentioned earlier use it. And it's really awesome because basically the way it works is it will analyze your program, figure out all the different possible types, based on the way you've used things. And it'll let you know if you've done something that doesn't make sense. It'll give you compile time type errors. And it'll let you know where you can define types to give it more information to provide more of an analysis at compile time to the point where it can cover your entire program, just like TypeScript would. But it requires way, way less work. And this is really what kind of kills TypeScript for me. I'm just like, why? Like, I imagine it's probably related to being a superset of JavaScript itself or something. I don't know. I don't really know the details. All I know is that it takes a lot more work to properly specify types in a TypeScript program than in other languages. So ultimately I would love if what we really had was sort of an extension or a superset of JavaScript that worked more like I've seen in other languages that use inference to figure out types for the most part and don't really make you do so much extra work. So basically, to sum it up, TypeScript is, in my opinion, very costly for the benefits it provides. So sure, in some cases, I reach for it as a tool, but it's very far down in my toolbox. Like I do a lot of things before I pull out typing. Or static type checking, I should be very clear. So it's just really far down. And I think if you're someone that's really into TypeScript, and even if you're not, actually, what I would recommend doing is just maybe try and experiment. Maybe start a new project, or as you're starting a new project or something, try to actively allocate more time to design and less to typing and things like